lands or never gave the property back, even after the court case was resolved. So it was just an excuse to take their property. That's right. Robert Ignatius Burns informs us that in the Malaga region, and I quote, violations and sly interpretations by the authorities soon killed the surrender treaty privileges made at Granada. Granada was the last Moorish stronghold in Spain, 1492. Robbery and harassment reflected the Europeans' freely expressed scorn for their despised adversaries. End of quote. So essentially, like ungrateful children, Europeans deliberately chose to forget the great contributions which the Moors had made to Europe's own civilization and ascension. Later, the Pope made a decision to pass an edict requiring the training of Moorish children in Catholic school between the ages of 3 and 15 years. This occurs in 1568, and it's ultimately met with a failed revolt by those remaining Moors in the nascent kingdom, or the new kingdom of Spain. The Moors are fully aware of what Catholic training would do to their children. It was designed to capture, destroy, and/or dehumanize the minds of their youth and to distort their future. I had a student tell me he's of German extraction, but he's born in the United States in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Went to Catholic school. He told me that in his Catholic school, they were taught that, use his words, blacks were the cursed sons of Ham. Now, this isn't 100 years ago. This isn't 10 years ago. This was last week in my class. He also said that he was taught, of course, that the Egyptians were quote-unquote white, and several other mythological stories. Not even myth, just lies. And I realized, again, how important historical study and clarity is. After this 1568 passing of the edict, there's a revolt. Lasts about 3 years. As a result, the Moors are expelled in mass once again. Another wave of expulsion. With the rise of Europe's power during the 16th century, ironically with the help of Moorish knowledge, a new worldview is duly imposed. Whereas once the Moors had been revered and envied in several parts of Europe, now a dark African hue was to increasingly become an anathema or a curse in the Western world. Let us not forget that Europeans initially had black Madonnas, and still do. Let us not forget then that there were Europeans who were fully aware of the significance of African people in their own society. In fact, when I go to the slides, you'll see exactly just how aware and, in fact, how proud they were to put them in their coats of arms. But the ascension of European powers meant the ascension of their phenotype, meaning their physical appearance, which was typified by a pale, pinkish complexion. A societal framework of light making right emerges with regard to complexion. Increasing Western influence on the international scene then results in the further stratification of the African world and the ever-increasing need to devalue African peoples. Such an increase in European organization and military prowess, because the Europeans, due to their value system, Diop would say that the environment required that they develop an emphasis on military might and conquest, and the desire to emphasize military technology, develop cannons beyond what other nations had done, use gunpowder beyond what other nations like the Chinese or the Egyptians had done, and extend their influence beyond their borders so that they could get control of resources. And this is what occurs. This extension to other parts of the world, of course, doesn't just threaten Africa. It also threatens the Americas with our Native American brothers and sisters here, Asians, and the Asiatic world as a whole. Consequently, we see in the 16th century a Moroccan ruler, Al-Mansur, in 1591, attacking and sacking Timbuktu with the aid of gun-toting Spanish Catholic mercenaries. So here you have a Moroccan ruler, a Moorish ruler, in 1591, who is attacking people within his own kingdom. This attack was heavily criticized by Africa's Marabout brotherhoods in what is now Morocco and Mauritania. In terms of these Marabouts, also known as Sidis, lords, or Mulis, which is teachers. In fact, it gives a whole new perspective to when you hear Italians calling African people Mulis. They say it means eggplant, but it also is a Moorish Maghreb term for teacher. So ironically, just as many of us would run from being called African, we got people running from being called a teacher because we don't know ourselves. So they must laugh after it's finished because some of them probably know where it really comes from. But these Marabouts have been non-Orthodox adherents, meaning they were non-Sunni, but they were Muslim. They had cloistered themselves within, in many cases, isolated communities or even fortresses, and had dedicated themselves to defending Moorish imperial boundaries from Catholic European encroachment. These Marabout women and men held that certain persons were living saints with a special ability to communicate God's grace or Allah's grace to people within their own community. These Marabout orders simply argued that African Muslims should not be attacking other African Muslims, period. But the Moroccan ruler, Al-Mansur, saw his justification in the following. Number one, he declared this was an old territorial dispute with Mali over salt mines. Two, he said, I need gold to fund my efforts against Catholic European encroachment into North and Northwest Africa. And lastly, in the contention that the Muslims of Mali were not proper Muslims. And if you read Ibn Battuta, and he talks about his travel to Mali and how the customs within Mali were very different in terms of Islam. There's a custom in Orthodox Islam which says that women are not supposed to be in the presence of anyone other than any male except for a family member. Well, in Mali that wasn't practiced, and when Ibn Battuta approached one of his Malian friends and he saw that there was a woman in the back in the courtyard talking to a man, he asked him, he said, is that your brother or is that an uncle or someone? And he said, no, that's a friend of my wife's. And he said, well, we don't do that in our country. And this Malian Muslim said, well, you may not do it in your country, but here we trust our women. So the idea of having a different interpretation of Islam was also grounds for, at least in Al-Mansur's view, of legitimizing an attack upon African people. The pages of Western texts, historical and otherwise, would ultimately become filled with assertions of quote-unquote Negro inferiority. Negro, of course, being the term used to classify African captives. This is very important to point out. As the Spanish and the Portuguese and even the English took African people as captives, they labeled them as Negroes, after the Spanish term for a black thing. In fact, if I back up, in Spain, and some of you may have remembered my lecture last time, and I mentioned how the term Morisco and Mudéjar came to existence. You had a situation where as the Moors lost power in Spain, they were reclassified, they were relabeled. They're now called by Spanish Catholic authorities not Moros anymore, or Moors. They're now called Mudéjars, which means the ones permitted to remain or the broken ones. They also use the term Morisco, which means